The Galactic Concord had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and no one remembered a time before its laws shaped the destiny of every living creature in the known universe. Over 4,000 civilizations answered to its authority and paid tribute to its councils and followed its countless rules without question, because the Concord had brought peace to a galaxy that had once burned with endless war. Every species knew the laws by heart because they were carved into massive black stone monuments on every capital world, from the frozen moons of the outer rim to the burning cores of the central systems. There were laws about trade and laws about territory and laws about weapons and laws about first contact with primitive species but one. Law stood apart from all the others, and it was written in letters larger than any other words on those ancient stones. Edict 7 declared in simple terms that no species and no civilization and no individual should ever antagonize mankind under any circumstances. The law offered no explanation, and the public archives contained no history that might reveal why this single fragile species deserved such protection. Young races asked their elders about the meaning of this strange command, but the elders would only shake their heads and change the subject with fear dancing in their ancient eyes. The crystalline beings called the Vethkai, who had lived for millions of years, refused to speak of it at all. The gaseous entities known as the Illuminari would dim their lights and drift away whenever someone mentioned humanity. The ancient Korati, who remembered the birth of stars, would simply say that some knowledge was too dangerous to share. Commander Vexner of the Zithan Rebel Confederacy thought all of this was complete and utter nonsense. He stood on the bridge of his massive warship called the Defiance and looked out at the stars, with contempt burning in his yellow eyes. The Zithan were a proud reptilian species with scales of deep blue and claws that could tear through metal, and they had been fighting against the Concord for 30 long and bloody years. Once they had controlled 100 systems, but now they were pushed to the edges of civilized space, with only a handful of worlds left to call their own. Their rebellion was dying, and everyone knew it, but Vexner refused to accept defeat. He called his war council to the great chamber at the heart of the Defiance, and 12 of his most trusted commanders gathered around the holographic display that showed their desperate situation. "We need resources," Vexner growled as he pointed at the map with one clawed finger. "We need weapons and fuel and food, and we need something that will make the entire galaxy take notice of us again." His second in command was a scarred female warrior named Veska, who had fought beside him for 20 years. "The Concord protects every valuable target," she said with frustration clear in her voice. "We cannot strike at their core worlds, and we cannot raid their supply lines without losing more ships than we can afford." Vexner let his gaze drift across the map until it settled on a small cluster of human systems near the border of rebel space. "What about them?" he asked with a cold smile spreading across his scaled face. The chamber went silent, and every commander stared at him with shock and disbelief. "Commander," Veska said carefully, "Edict 7 forbids any action against human territory, and the punishment for breaking that law is what?" Vexner interrupted with a harsh laugh. "The Concord already wants to destroy us, and they already hunt us across the galaxy, so what more can they do?" An old voice spoke from the shadows at the edge of the chamber, and everyone turned to see Corvin, the ancient Korati advisor who had defected from the Concord centuries ago. His body was withered and his eyes were clouded with age, but his voice still carried the weight of 900 years of wisdom. "You do not understand what you are suggesting, young commander," Corvin said, as he stepped forward slowly. "Edict 7 is not meant to protect the humans from us." "Then what is it for?" Vexner demanded. "It is meant to protect us from them," the old Korati whispered. Vexner threw back his head and laughed, and several of his commanders joined him, because the idea seemed so ridiculous. Humanity controlled only 47 systems in a galaxy of millions. Their ships were small, and their weapons were average, and their bodies were soft and weak. They lived barely 100 years, while Zithan warriors could fight for 3 centuries. They had no psychic powers and no hive minds and no dimensional technology. They were friendly traders and peaceful diplomats who seemed content to stay in their little corner of the stars. "Look at them," Vexner said as he pulled up data on human civilization. They are nothing special, and they have nothing that should make us afraid." The Drekken hegemony thought the same thing. Corvin said quietly. "Who?" asked Theska with confusion on her face. "Exactly, the old Korati," replied, and there was something terrible in his ancient eyes. "No one remembers them anymore because they no longer exist, and they stopped existing after they tried to exterminate humanity 8,000 years ago." "Old stories and myths," Vexener said dismissively. "The Concord uses these legends to scare us away from easy targets because humans are valuable trading partners." He turned back to the map and pointed at a human colony called New Geneva. It was a prosperous world with orbital shipyards that built merchant vessels and massive refineries that processed fusion fuel. Taking this colony would give the rebellion everything it needed to survive another decade. "We attack New Geneva," Vexener declared. "We take their ships and their fuel and their workers, and we show the galaxy that the Zithan Confederacy still has teeth." Corvin stepped forward with desperation in his voice. "I beg you to reconsider," he pleaded. "I have lived for 900 years, and I have seen things that would break your mind if I described them, and I am telling you that this path leads only to destruction. Your fear has made you weak, old one," Vexener replied coldly. "Guards, please escort our advisor to his quarters where he can rest." Two Zithan soldiers grabbed Corvin by the arms and dragged him toward the door. "You will doom us all," the ancient Korati shouted as he struggled against his captors. "The humans are not what they appear to be, and when you wake the sleeping giant, you will understand why the galaxy trembles at the thought of their anger." The doors closed behind him, and his warnings faded into silence. Vexener looked at his commanders and saw doubt on some of their faces, but he also saw hunger and desperation. "Prepare the fleet," he ordered. "We strike New Geneva in 3 days." The commanders saluted and left to make preparations. Theska lingered for a moment and looked at Vexener with worry in her eyes. "Are you certain about this?" she asked. "I have never been more certain of anything," he replied as he stared at the small dot on the map that represented New Geneva. "In 3 days we will prove that humanity bleeds, just like everyone else." He did not know that his words would soon be proven true in ways he could never have imagined. He did not know that the ancient warnings were not myths but memories. He did not know that somewhere in the depths of human space a vast and terrible machinery had waited for thousands of years for someone foolish enough to give it purpose. The countdown to catastrophe had begun, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. The rebel fleet emerged from hyperspace like predators descending upon helpless prey, and the morning sky above New Geneva suddenly filled with 12 massive warships. Commander Vexener stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the peaceful human colony spread out below him with its gleaming cities and busy shipyards and towering refineries that pumped fuel into the hungry ships of galactic commerce. "All ships report ready for combat," Theska announced from her station. "The humans have detected us, and they are launching their defense platforms." Vexener studied the enemy forces and felt contempt rise in his chest, because the humans had only 6 small defense stations and a handful of fighter craft to protect their entire world. "This will be easier than I expected," he said with satisfaction. "All ships begin the assault and target the orbital defenses first." Plasma cannons roared to life across the rebel fleet, and brilliant beams of green fire streaked through the void toward the human stations. The first platform exploded in a ball of flame and debris, and then another followed and another. Human fighters swarmed out to meet the attackers, but they were so small and so few against the might of the Zithan armada. Vexener watched them fight with something like admiration, because they did not run, and they did not surrender. Every human pilot threw themselves against his warships with desperate courage, even though they must have known they could not win. One fighter managed to damage a rebel cruiser before it was destroyed, and another rammed directly into the engine of a Zithan destroyer. "They fight well for such fragile creatures," Theska observed. "Courage without power is just a slower form of suicide." Vexener replied coldly. "Continue the attack." Within 2 hours every defense platform was destroyed, and the human fighters were reduced to burning wreckage floating in orbit. The rebel fleet descended through the atmosphere, and landing craft poured from their holds, carrying thousands of Zithan soldiers hungry for victory. Vexener had given clear orders before the attack: capture the shipyards and the refineries intact, take the skilled workers as prisoners to serve the rebellion, Execute any military personnel who resisted. Minimize civilian casualties because dead workers were useless workers. But war was chaos, and his soldiers had been losing for 30 years, and they were filled with rage and frustration that demanded release. The first massacre happened at the central spaceport when a group of human security officers tried to evacuate civilians onto transport ships. Zithan's soldiers cut them down with plasma rifles, and the shooting did not stop. When the officers fell, panic spread through the crowd and people ran in every direction, and the soldiers kept firing because they could no longer tell the difference between threats and innocence. News of the slaughter spread through the ranks, and something dark awakened in the hearts of the rebel army. Years of humiliation and defeat had created a monster that now saw every human face as the face of an enemy. Soldiers broke into homes and dragged families into the streets. They burned schools and hospitals and community centers. They shot anyone who ran and anyone who did not run fast enough. A medical frigate called Mercy's Hope tried to flee with wounded civilians aboard, and it broadcast surrender codes on every frequency begging for safe passage. A Zithan cruiser captain named Voroth ignored the codes and opened fire. The medical ship broke apart in the upper atmosphere, and burning debris rained down on the city below. Commander Vexener received reports of the atrocities from his command post in the conquered government building, and he felt the first cold touch of doubt in his heart. "This was not what I ordered," he said quietly. "War creates its own orders," Veska replied, and her voice was heavy with something that might have been shame. By the time the sun set on New Geneva, the killing had finally stopped, but the damage was done. 83,000 humans lay dead in the streets and the fields and the ruins of their homes. 83,000 souls who had woken that morning expecting an ordinary day and had instead met a violent and senseless end. Vexener walked through the central plaza of the capital city and looked at the destruction his forces had caused. Smoke rose from 100 fires, and the air was thick with the smell of death. Zithan's soldiers rounded up the survivors and herded them into makeshift prison camps. Among the prisoners was a human woman with gray hair and blood on her face and burns on her arms. She was old, but she stood straight and proud, and she looked at Vexener with eyes that held no fear. "You are the commander," she said, and it was not a question. "I am," Vexener replied, "and you should kneel before me if you want to live," the woman laughed, and it was a cold and hollow sound. "You have no idea what you have done today," she said. "I have shown the galaxy that humanity bleeds like everyone else." Vexener answered with false confidence. "We do bleed," the woman agreed, and a strange smile crossed her face. "That was never the question." "Then what is the question?" he demanded. "The question is what happens after we bleed," she said. "The question is what wakes up. When our children die." Vexener felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to laugh. "Take her away," he ordered his soldiers. "She is clearly in shock." The woman did not struggle as they dragged her toward the prison camp, but she called back over her shoulder with a voice that carried across the ruined plaza. "The Prometheus protocol will be activated within hours, and when it is, you will learn why the elder races carved warnings into stone." Vexener tried to ignore her words, but they echoed in his mind as he returned to his command post. 3 days passed, and the rebellion celebrated its greatest victory in decades. Ships were loaded with captured fuel and equipment, and thousands of human workers were forced onto transport vessels bound for Zithan space. Vexener sent messages to every corner of the galaxy boasting of his triumph and mocking the ancient law that had failed to protect humanity. On the 4th day, a transmission reached every communication device in known space. It came from Earth itself, from a building that appeared on no maps, and from an office that officially did not exist. The transmission contained only 3 words in every language known to galactic civilization: Prometheus protocol activated. Within hours, the reactions began. The Vefkai closed their borders and recalled every ship and every citizen from foreign space. The Illuminari dimmed their lights and retreated to the dark spaces between stars. The Korati sent a single message to the Galactic Concord that said only, "May the universe have mercy on us all." Even the Concord itself went silent, and its mighty fleets pulled back from the borders of human space. Commander Vexener watched these reactions with growing unease. "What is happening?" He demanded why is everyone acting like the galaxy is about to end. Old Corvin was brought before him once more, and the ancient advisor looked at Vexener with eyes full of pity. I tried to warn you, Corvin said softly. The Prometheus Protocol is not a weapon, and it is not a fleet, and it is not a plan. Then what is it? Vexener shouted. It is a promise, the old Korati replied, a promise made 8,000 years ago, in the ashes of human colonies burned by the Drekan hegemony. What promise? Corvin closed his ancient eyes and spoke words that seemed to come from the depths of time itself. Never again, and if again, then never. Unpunished, he opened his eyes and looked at Vexener with something close to compassion. You have awakened something that should have been left sleeping, and now all we can do is wait and watch and pray that humanity shows you more mercy than you showed them. Outside the windows of the command post, the stars seemed to grow darker, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in the vast emptiness between galaxies, something ancient and terrible was stirring, and it was very, very angry. The message spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass, and within days every civilization was talking about the Prometheus Protocol. Intelligence officers from 1,000 species searched their databases for any information about what the words might mean. Scholars studied ancient texts, and historians dug through forgotten archives, and scientists analyzed every piece of data they could find about human military capabilities. They found nothing. The humans had always been open about their technology and their weapons and their fleet strength. They shared their knowledge freely and traded fairly and never showed any signs of hidden power. Their navy consisted of modest patrol ships and light cruisers designed for defense rather than conquest. Their weapons were standard plasma cannons and missile systems that any mid-level civilization could match. On paper, they were one of the weaker species in the galactic community. So why were the elder races fleeing in terror? At 3 simple words, Commander Vexener demanded answers from every source he could reach, but the younger species knew nothing, and the elder races refused to speak. Finally, he summoned old Corvin to his chambers and ordered the ancient Korati to reveal everything he knew. You want the truth, Corvin said warily, then you must first understand that what I am about to tell you has been deliberately erased from every public record in the galaxy. Erased by whom? Vexener demanded. By everyone, Corvin replied, by the Concord and by the elder races, and most importantly by humanity itself, because they did not want to be feared. He settled his ancient body into a chair and began to speak in a voice heavy with memory. 8,000 years ago, humanity was a young species with only a dozen colonies spread across a small region of space. They were curious and friendly and eager to meet other civilizations, and they approached the galaxy with open hands and hopeful hearts. The dominant power in that era was the Drekan hegemony, which controlled 600 systems and commanded the mightiest fleet anyone had ever seen. The Drekan were proud and cruel, and they believed that only the strong deserved to exist. When they encountered humanity, they saw a weak species that might one day become a threat, and they decided to eliminate that threat before it could grow. Vexener listened with growing unease as the old Korati continued. The Drekan attacked without warning and without mercy. They burned 3 human colonies and killed 1 billion people in a single month. They declared that they would not stop until every human was dead, and they gathered their entire fleet to strike at Earth itself. The humans begged for help from other species, but everyone was too afraid of the Drekan to intervene, so humanity faced extinction alone. With no allies and no hope, Corvin paused, and his ancient eyes seemed to look at something far away. And then something happened, he said softly, something that no one has ever been able to explain. What happened? Vexener asked, and he was surprised to hear fear in his own voice. The Drekan hegemony ceased to exist, Corvin replied. You mean they were defeated? No, the old Korati said firmly. I mean they ceased to exist. As if they had never been. Their 600 worlds were found empty, with cities standing silent and streets filled with dust. Their mighty fleet was discovered drifting dead in space, with no crew aboard any ship. Every Drekan everywhere in the galaxy simply vanished in a single night. No bodies were ever found, and no explanation was ever given. One day they were the most powerful empire in the quadrant, and the next day they were gone. Vexener felt cold spreading through his body. "That is impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I was a young scholar when it happened," Corvin said. "I saw the empty Drekken worlds. With my own eyes I walked through their abandoned cities, and I felt the terrible silence of places where millions had lived just days before, and I saw the human ships that patrolled those empty systems, making sure that no one investigated too closely. When the elder races asked humanity what had happened, the humans simply smiled and said that the universe had delivered justice. We never asked again." Vexner stood and paced across his chamber, trying to process what he had heard. "But that was 8,000 years ago," he argued. "Surely humanity cannot still possess such power." "You do not understand," Corvin said sadly. "The Drekken were not the only ones. Over the millennia, there have been 12 other species that ignored the warnings and attacked human civilians. Every single one of them met the same fate. Some were erased overnight like the Drekken, others were dismantled slowly over years, until nothing remained of their civilization. One species tried to unleash a biological weapon on a human colony, and within a month, every member of that species developed a mysterious illness that made them sterile. They died out within 3 generations with no children to carry on their legacy. Do you see the pattern, Commander? Humanity never attacks first, and they never threaten, and they never boast of their capabilities, but when someone harms their innocent people, they respond with overwhelming and precise and utterly unstoppable force, and then they return to being peaceful traders as if nothing had happened." As Corvin finished speaking, an officer rushed into the chamber with terror on his face. "Commander," the officer gasped, "we are losing contact with our frontier outposts." "What do you mean losing contact?" Vexner demanded. "They are going silent one by one," the officer replied. "No distress calls and no battle reports, just silence. 17 outposts have stopped responding in the last 6 hours." Vexner ran to his command console and pulled up a map of rebel territory. Red dots showed the locations of the silent outposts, and they formed a line pointing directly toward the Zithan home system. "Send scout ships to investigate," he ordered. "We already did, Commander," the officer said, and his voice trembled. "They found nothing. The outposts are gone," the officer continued. "Not destroyed, but gone, as if they were never there. No debris and no wreckage and no bodies, just empty space where our stations used to be." Corvin rose from his chair and looked at Vexner with ancient sorrow. "It has begun," the old Korati said. "The humans are coming, and they are taking their time, because they want you to feel what they felt. They want you to watch your territory shrink day by day. They want you to know that nothing you do can stop them. They want you to understand true helplessness before they arrive at your door." Vexner stared at the map and watched as another dot turned red, another outpost gone without a trace. He had wanted to show the galaxy that humanity could bleed. Now he was beginning to understand that making humanity bleed was never the hard part. The hard part was surviving what came after. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, something vast and terrible was moving closer with every passing hour. Something that had waited 8,000 years for a fool like him to give it purpose once again. Commander Vexner had never known true fear until the day the humans came for his homeworld. For 3 weeks, he had watched his territory shrink as outposts and patrol ships and entire military bases vanished without explanation. His scouts found nothing but empty space where Zithan forces had stood just hours before. No wreckage and no survivors and no clues about what was taking them. It was as if some great invisible hand was erasing his rebellion piece by piece. Vexner responded by pulling every ship back to the Zithan home system. 217 warships formed a defensive sphere around his planet. They were the largest concentration of military power the rebellion had ever assembled. Long-range sensors swept the void in every direction, searching for any sign of approaching enemies. Minefields were deployed in all approach vectors. Planetary shields were raised to maximum power. Every weapon was loaded and every soldier was ready. Vexner stood on the bridge of the Defiance and stared at the tactical display, showing his impressive fleet. "Let them come," he said to Theska, who stood at his side. "We have enough firepower to destroy any fleet in the galaxy. The humans have only 50 combat ships in their entire navy." Theska replied, but her voice lacked confidence. "We outnumber them 4 to 1. Then we have nothing to fear." But even as he spoke those words, Vexner felt the cold grip of doubt in his heart. The elder races had fled their border systems. The Galactic Concord had sent no ships to punish him for breaking Edict 7. Everyone was staying far away from this conflict, as if they knew something terrible was about to happen. Hours passed, and then days, and the Zithan fleet waited in tense silence. Sensors detected nothing. Space remained empty and quiet. Some of the younger officers began to relax and joke that the humans were too afraid to attack. Vexener knew better. He remembered the old woman on New Geneva and her cold smile. He remembered her words about what wakes up when human children die. On the 7th day of waiting, the first strange report came in. A cruiser captain named Drax reported that his sensors had detected a ghost signal. For just 1 second, his instruments showed a massive object directly ahead of his ship. Then the signal vanished and there was nothing. Sensor malfunction, the tactical officer suggested. Run a diagnostic on all sensor rays, Vexener ordered. Before the diagnostic could complete, another ghost signal appeared. Then another and another. Ships across the fleet reported brief flickers of contact with objects that seemed impossibly large. The signals appeared and disappeared like phantoms dancing at the edge of perception. "What is happening?" Veska demanded as she studied her console. "I do not know," Vexener admitted. Then the stars began to disappear. One by one, the distant points of light that surrounded the Zithan system winked out, as if something was blocking them. Vexener watched in growing horror as the darkness spread across the sky. "They are here," Corvin said from behind him, and the old Korathi's voice was barely a whisper. The commander spun to face his advisor, where he shouted, "Our sensors show nothing. Your sensors were designed to detect ships that want to be detected." Corvin replied, "The humans stopped wanting to be detected a very long time ago." A blinding flash erupted directly in front of the Defiance, and Vexener threw his arm up to shield his eyes. When he lowered it, he saw something that broke his understanding of what was possible. A human ship hung in space less than 1,000 meters from his bridge. But it was not like any human ship he had ever seen. It was black as the void itself, with curves and angles that hurt his eyes to look at. It was the size of a small moon, and it had appeared from nowhere without a single warning. From any sensor on any ship in his fleet, more flashes erupted across the defensive sphere. As dozens of similar vessels materialized among his warships, they were already inside his formation. They had crossed 1,000 light-years without triggering a single alarm. "All ships open fire," Vexener screamed into his communicator. The Zithan fleet responded with everything it had. Plasma cannons roared and missiles streaked through the void, and energy beams lanced out toward the human vessels. The weapons passed through the enemy hulls like light through glass. Some shots seemed to bend around the human ships as if deflected by invisible shields. Others simply vanished into the black surfaces without leaving any mark at all. "Our weapons are having no effect," Veska reported, and her voice cracked with fear. "I do not understand what we are shooting at." The humans did not share this problem. Beams of pure white light erupted from the black ships, and wherever they touched Zithan vessels, those vessels simply ceased to exist. No explosions and no debris, just instant vaporization. The light moved with impossible precision, targeting weapons and engines and command centers. In the first minute of battle, 30 Zithan ships were destroyed. Vexener watched in helpless rage as his mighty fleet was torn apart. Evasive maneuvers, he ordered all ships scatter and run, but there was nowhere to run. The human vessels moved faster than any ship had a right to move. They appeared and disappeared at will, blinking in and out of existence, to strike from unexpected angles. Some Zithan captains tried to ram the enemy, but their ships passed through the black hulls, as if flying through smoke. The battle lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, 117 Zithan warships had been reduced to dust. Only the Defiance remained intact, floating alone in a graveyard of debris. Vexener realized the humans had spared his flagship deliberately. They wanted him alive. A single shuttle detached from the largest human ship and descended toward the Zithan homeworld. Vexener watched it land in the central plaza of his capital city. A door opened and a figure emerged. She was a human female, old and gray, with a simple uniform that bore no rank or insignia. She walked calmly through the streets, filled with terrified Zithan civilians, who parted before her like water before a stone. She walked for over an hour until she reached the government complex, where Vexener had been dragged. From his crashed escape pod, guards surrounded her with weapons raised, but she ignored them. She stopped in front of Vexener and studied him with cold blue eyes. 83,000, she said, and her voice was soft. That was the count at New Geneva. Vexener's throat was too tight to speak. Children died in their classrooms, the woman continued, families burned in their homes, and doctors died trying to save their patients. What are you going to do? Vexener finally managed to ask. The woman was silent for a long moment. Humanity does not believe in genocide, she said at last. We are not the Drekken, and we will not erase your species. Relief flooded through Vexener like cool water. Then the woman continued speaking, and that relief turned to ashes. But you will remember, she said, your children will remember, and their children will remember. 100 generations from now, when the stars themselves have changed your people, will still tell the story of what happens when you harm our innocent. The universe will watch and learn, and no one will ever forget why Edict 7 exists. She turned away and walked back toward her shuttle. Vexener wanted to call after her. He wanted to beg for mercy or demand an explanation or simply understand what was about to happen. But his voice failed him, and he could only watch as the woman disappeared into the sky. The true punishment was about to begin. The Zithan people waited for death that never came. They huddled in their homes and shelters, expecting human soldiers to pour from the sky and burn their cities as the rebels had burned New Geneva. They expected vengeance written in fire and blood. Instead, they received something far more devastating. The human fleet remained in orbit for 30 days, and during that time, they did not fire a single weapon at the planet below. They simply watched and waited while the Zithan trembled. On the 31st day, a delegation of human diplomats landed at the capital and presented their terms. Every Zithan shipyard would be dismantled. Every weapons factory would be reduced to atoms. Every military vessel would be confiscated. Every scientist who had worked on weapons technology would be relocated to distant colonies, where they could never gather together again. For 1,000 years, the Zithan people would possess no military and no space industry, and no capacity for war. They would survive only by the protection of the Galactic Concord. They would exist only by the mercy of humanity. Any violation of these terms would result in consequences that the treaty did not specify. But everyone understood. Commander Vexener was brought before the human delegation in chains. Why, he asked the gray-haired woman who seemed to lead the humans, why not simply destroy us and be done with it? Because destruction teaches nothing, she replied. The universe would see another dead species and shrug. But this way they will see a living lesson that remembers its mistake for 1,000 generations. They will see that humanity offers mercy to those who harm us, not because we are weak, but because we choose to be better than our enemies. And they will see that our mercy still has teeth. Vexener was taken to a small cell where he would spend the rest of his life. But the true punishment was not his imprisonment. The true punishment was knowledge. On the same day the treaty was signed, humanity released the classified histories that had been hidden for 8,000 years. Every species in the galaxy received complete records of the Drekken hegemony and its fate. They learned about the 12 other civilizations that had made the same mistake. They saw evidence of weapons and technologies that no one had imagined possible. They learned that humanity had never stopped preparing. Behind every trade agreement and diplomatic smile, humanity had been building. They had been waiting. They had been remembering. The ghost fleet that had destroyed the Zithan Armada was only a fraction of their true power. Hidden bases scattered across the galaxy held weapons that could crack planets and fleets, that could darken stars. Artificial intelligences thousands of years old monitored every communication for any hint of threats against human civilians. Soldiers trained from birth waited in cryogenic sleep, ready to wake at a moment's notice. All of this had existed in secret while humanity played the role of peaceful traders. The Prometheus Protocol was not a weapon or a fleet or a battle plan. It was a promise made in the ashes of ancient massacres. Never again would humanity be caught helpless. Never again would their children die while the galaxy watched and did nothing. And if someone was foolish enough to harm human innocence, then the response would be swift and overwhelming and utterly unstoppable. The obsidian monoliths on every capital world were updated with new inscriptions below Edict 7. The words were carved in 1,000 languages so that every being in the galaxy could understand. They are kind because they choose to be. They are gentle because they can afford to be. Do not mistake their patience for weakness. Do not mistake their mercy for inability. In the mathematics of war, humanity solved for victory long ago. They simply prefer not to show their work. The news spread across the stars, and civilizations that had never thought much about humanity suddenly looked at them with new eyes. Some felt fear, and some felt respect, and some felt awe. The human ambassadors continued to smile and trade fairly and honor their treaties. They helped younger species develop their technology and mediated disputes between rivals. They remained the friendly neighbors they had always appeared to be. But now everyone understood what lay beneath that friendly exterior. Now everyone knew why the elder races had trembled at three simple words. The Zithan people rebuilt their civilization under the terms of the treaty. They became farmers and artists and philosophers because they had no other choice. Their children grew up hearing stories about the day their ancestors had made the terrible mistake. Those children told the stories to their own children, and those children told the stories to the next generation. 100 years passed, and then 500, and then 1,000. The terms of the treaty finally expired, but the Zithan had no desire to rebuild their military. The memory of what they had lost was too fresh even after a millennium. They remained peaceful and never again raised weapons against anyone. Commander Vexener lived for another 80 years in his small cell. Human historians visited him regularly to record his testimony. He told the story 1,000 times. He described how he had dismissed the warnings and mocked the ancient law. He explained how he had thought humanity weak because they chose to be gentle. He confessed that he had laughed at the fear of the elder races. In his final interview, he was very old and very tired. He looked out his window at the stars that his people could no longer travel among. A young human historian asked him what lesson he wanted future generations to take from his story. Vexener was quiet for a long time. "I understand now," he finally said. "The law was never meant to protect humanity." "What do you mean?" the historian asked. "Edict 7, Vexener replied, "all those warnings carved in stone on every world. The elder races were not trying to protect the humans from us. They were trying to protect us from the humans. They knew what we would face if we were foolish enough to wake the sleeping giant. They tried to save us from ourselves." He closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. "I was too arrogant to listen," he whispered. "I thought I knew better than species that had lived for millions of years. I thought courage and determination were enough to overcome any enemy. I learned that some enemies cannot be overcome. I learned that some battles are lost before they begin. I learned that the most dangerous creature in the universe is not the one that threatens constantly, but the one that waits patiently until it has no choice but to act." The old commander opened his eyes one last time and looked at the historian with something like peace. "Tell them," he said, "tell everyone who watches this recording. Humanity bleeds just like everyone else. That was never the question. The question was always what happens next. And now the whole galaxy knows the answer." He died 3 days later, and his testimony was broadcast across the stars. It became required viewing in military academies and diplomatic schools. It was translated into every language and stored in every archive. And for 10,000 years afterward, no one ever broke Edict 7 again. The law remained carved in stone on every capital world. The warnings remained written in letters larger than any other. And humanity remained exactly what they had always been. Kind and gentle and patient and merciful. Because they could afford to be. Because they had solved for victory long ago. Because they had made a promise in the ashes of ancient massacres. And the stars themselves remembered what happened to those who made them break that promise. The end.